That'd be like talking to a Muslim and then saying, "Oh, we believe that there's one God." Like, what's the point of disagreement? So, depending on how you want to parse out the differences or whether there is a difference, the majority of your theologians are going to say there is a difference, and the Scotists would say, "Well, fides formata is justice because God simply has made it to be such a thing." On the one hand, the nature of concupiscence. On the other hand, the nature of eternal and temporal punishments. I actually think that's important. Okay, if a Protestant believes that justification consists of the remission of sins, the gratuitous acceptance of God, and the infusion of justice, where would you disagree? Well, obviously, we think the remission of sins, the acceptance of God, and the infusion of justice are part of justification. So that's not the point of disagreement. That'd be like talking to a Muslim and then saying, "Oh, we believe that there's one God." Like, what's the point of disagreement? I don't get what. Sorry, English hog. I don't get what the point is here. Because I think we know where the disagreement is, and the disagreement is, on the one hand, depending on how one wants to define fiducia, whether fiducia or fiduciary faith, which for those who don't know, that's the Protestant articulation of what justifying faith is, where we say fides formata, or formed faith, or faith formed by charity. So depending on how you want to parse out the differences or whether there is a difference, the majority of your theologians are going to say there is a difference, and the fides formata is somehow, not what they're talking about. Although there's a minority who say that it's the same. So depending on how you want to parse that out, fiduciary faith versus fides formata, but I don't think this is really the big one. I do think the big one ends up being, on the one hand, the nature of concupiscence. On the other hand, the nature of eternal and temporal punishments. I actually think that's important, and the satisfaction of the guilt incurred by venial sins, of that venial debt, which completely leads to the logic of purgatory for us. I think that's important, but most important, I think it's going to be the manner in which fides formata versus fiduciary faith is going to relate to justification. Because for you guys, and this is something which is novel, I think I'm comfortable saying that it's novel. You're going to say that fiduciary faith is a moral instrument of apprehending the righteousness of Christ, which is extrinsic to you. When it comes to Thomas, Scotus, the Augustinians, when it comes to basically everyone else, when it comes to the medieval scholastics, when it comes to the Catholic Church, fides formata is not merely a moral instrument for apprehending something outside of ourselves. Rather, it is truly and properly the formal cause of justification. So we are just because we have fides formata as a meritorious cause. Meritorious cause can be used in many senses. So that's the real question. It's not whether we have remission of sins. It's not whether we have gratuitous acceptance of God. It's not whether we have the infusion of justice. Those are all questions in which we can agree upon. The real question is, are we made just by the infusion of justice and stand before God as just and merit eternal life by the right rectitude of our soul, which happens by fides formata, whether in first act according to the Thomists or in second act according to the Scotists, or in disagreeing with both the Scotists and the Thomists? Do you hold that faith is something of a moral instrument apprehending something outside of ourselves? So that's the foundation right there of the question, and I think it's quite obvious the points of discontinuity that happened in the Reformation on that point. I kind of wanted to talk about a bit the difference between the Scotists and the Thomists, actually. But the Reformed will often, when it comes to justification, try to leverage Scotus. Well, some Reformed. The ones that I know who know Scotus the best won't try to leverage him in this way. But basically, Scotus, because of a different view of divine volition, held that the justice within us, rather than in first act, so basically considered antecedently to the volition of God in his ordained power, that in first act there is nothing which is adequate or at least proportioned to the reward of beatitude. But they do hold that in second act, so that God in his divine volition has made fides formata, especially charity, to be such a thing as to constitute justice. So for the Scotists, it's really a question of the relationship of the divine will. We would say that fides formata is justice because it is such a thing. And the Scotists would say, well, fides formata is justice because God simply has made it to be such a thing. So when we say that it's a formal cause, all we're saying is that it is such a thing. That's all we're saying. So we agree on that point of what is taught at the Council of Trent. We just disagree kind of on how we get there. And then second, there's also difference on what constitutes sanctifying grace. For the Thomists, sanctifying grace is going to reside in the nature of the soul, the root as a root, what's called an entitative habit. It's going to reside in the nature of the soul as the root, and it's going to flow forth as the theological virtues into the various faculties. And the right rectitude of those faculties in submission to God, that's going to constitute justice, but obviously not justice which is perfected yet due to the continual motions of concupiscence in the flesh. Whereas on the other hand, the Scotists are a bit different, because for the Scotists, they have a differing view on the relationship between the faculties and nature of the soul. Because Thomists, we believe that the nature of the soul is really distinct from its faculties. When it comes to the Scotists, they hold that they're formally distinct. So from the fact that they hold that it's formally distinct, that obviously places a problem with having a distinct entitative habit of sanctifying grace, which is in the root or nature of the soul. So they identify sanctifying grace with the theological virtues. So like these are the type of differences between Scotus and Thomas, if you're like curious about it. So like calling them reformed on the issue rather than closer, because they are obviously closer to the reformed because of their view of divine volition, the view of voluntarism. Calling them closer to the reformed is fine, but pretending like on justification there's some sort of strict identity or equality or agreement is plainly ridiculous.